The Archivist of Souls. The candle flickered in the draught that seeped through the poorly fitted shutters, casting dancing shadows on the thousands of documents carefully arranged in the castle's library. Vlad gently closed the red leather notebook he had just finished, the final confessions of a young woman from London who had died of tuberculosis 3 weeks earlier. He had followed her decline through her letters to her sister, then in her diary which he had acquired after the funeral. Each human life was a book that closed too quickly. For 3 centuries now, he had been collecting these fragments of existence with the meticulousness of a librarian and the tenderness of a father for his children. For that is what it was. These mortals were his spiritual children, even though they never suspected it. He rose from his ebony desk and slowly walked the aisles of his collection. Here, the love letters of 3 generations of a Venetian merchant family. There, the logbooks of an English captain who had explored the South Seas. Further on, the recipes and confidences of a French midwife who had delivered half a village before dying in her bed, surrounded by those she had helped bring into the world. Vlad knew each of these lives by heart. He had learned to read in all the languages of Europe, then beyond, so as not to lose any of these testimonies. He knew that Maria Benedetti had been afraid to marry Giovanni, that she had ended up loving him passionately, that she had mourned the death of their first child for years before finding joy again with the others. He knew Captain Hartwell's doubts in the face of storms, his nostalgia for England when contemplating tropical sunsets, his secret pride in having given his name to a small lost island. These stories had become his true nourishment. Oh, he still needed blood to survive, but it had become a mechanical gesture, almost medical. What truly kept him alive was this constant immersion in the humanity of others. Each love letter warmed him more than a hearth. Each confession of fear or hope touched him more deeply than any physical contact. He stopped before a particular section. Children's diaries. These were the most precious, as they captured humanity in its pure state, before social conventions came to constrain it. Little Margaret, 8 years old, who drew unicorns in the margins of her schoolgirl's notebook and recounted her conversations with her rag doll. Young Thomas, 10 years old, passionate about natural history, who described with touching seriousness his observations of birds in the family garden. These children had grown up, had their own children, had died long ago, but in these pages, they still lived, eternal in their innocence and wonder. Vlad had become the guardian of these fleeting moments that no one else cared to preserve. He returned to his desk where his evening correspondence awaited. Not his letters. He never received any, but those he intercepted, copied, put back in place before their recipients noticed anything. A subtle art he had perfected over the decades. The postman of London, Paris, Vienna never noticed this elegant gentleman who took a little too much interest in the mail. His powers allowed him to move in the shadows, to penetrate sleeping houses, to consult intimate diaries left on bedside tables. Tonight, he had before his eyes the correspondence between a father and his son who had gone to study at university. The young man was hiding his financial difficulties so as not to worry his family, and the father, for his part, was concealing his nascent illness so as not to disrupt his child's studies. This mutual tenderness, this reciprocal protection touched Vlad more than all the love poems he had ever read. For this was what he had lost in becoming what he was, the ability to love and be loved simply, naturally. Immortality was a golden prison whose bars were made of solitude. He could no longer truly bond with anyone, for how could he explain that he didn't age? How could he confess what he had become? And even if he could have, who would have accepted loving a living dead? So he loved by proxy. Through these lives he studied with the devotion of a monk copyist. He thrilled to the joys of these strangers, suffered from their sorrows, worried about their trials. He knew certain families better than their own members knew each other, for he alone had access to all their secrets, all their intimate thoughts. Sometimes he intervened discreetly. A lost letter that finally arrived at its destination at the crucial moment. An anonymous bequest that saved a family from ruin. A testimony that exonerated a wrongly accused man. These small miracles, he orchestrated from the shadows, invisible guardian angel of those whose existence he secretly shared. Over the years, an idea had begun to grow in him. All these stories he collected, these lives he preserved from oblivion, didn't they deserve to be shared? Not as they were. He respected the intimacy of his protégés too much for that. But transformed, sublimated, offered to the world in the form of fiction? He had begun to write, first timidly, then with more confidence. He mixed destinies, invented names, changed places, but preserved the essence of these lives, their beauty, their tragedy, their profound humanity. His manuscripts piled up in a chest, for he didn't dare show them to anyone. Who would publish the works of a man who officially existed nowhere? That's when he met Abraham Stoker. The Irish writer had come to the castle for research on local folklore. Vlad had first observed him from afar, intrigued by this man who seemed to share his passion for human stories. Stoker collected legends, testimonies, travel accounts with the same avidity with which he collected private correspondence. They had eventually met, almost by accident. Stoker had gotten lost in the forest on a stormy night, and Vlad had guided him to the castle. The writer was fascinated by this immense library, by his host's erudition, by his encyclopedic knowledge of local history. They had spent entire nights discussing, Stoker asking 1,000 questions about traditions, superstitions, historical figures of the region. Vlad answered with pleasure, happy to finally share his knowledge with someone who appreciated it. He had even shown some of his manuscripts to the Irishman, who had read them with admiration. "You have a rare gift for grasping the human soul," Stoker had told him. "These characters are strikingly realistic. One would think they had really existed. If he only knew," Vlad had thought. But he had merely smiled and accepted the compliment. Then Stoker had left, taking with him voluminous notes and, unknowingly, the inspiration for his future masterpiece. For in his notebooks were now mixed local legends and the confidences of his mysterious host. He had been struck by the melancholy of this cultured man, by his palpable solitude, by his particular relationship to death and time. Vlad had followed Stoker's career from a distance. When Dracula was published, he recognized certain elements of their conversations, certain details of the castle, certain reflections he had shared on immortality and solitude. But Stoker had transformed everything, had made him a bloodthirsty monster where he was only a melancholic collector of souls. He didn't hold it against him. On the contrary, he was fascinated to see how his true story had been reinvented, how his personal tragedy had become a universal myth. Stoker had made him the symbol of all predators, all nocturnal fears, all dangers that threaten innocence. Irony of fate. He who devoted his non-life to preserving and celebrating the humanity of others had become in fiction the symbol of everything that denies and destroys it. But perhaps it was justice, after all. For even if he loved humanity with passion, even if he venerated it and collected it as others collect butterflies, he remained fundamentally separated from it. He had become the eternal observer, the immortal witness, the one who watches life without being able to truly participate. In the silence of his library, surrounded by thousands of lives he had loved and preserved, Vlad took up his pen again. He had a new story to write, that of an Irish writer who had come looking for legends and had found much more than that. A story that would never be published, like all the others. For this was his destiny, to be the secret author of humanity, the archivist of its joys and sorrows, the silent guardian of its most beautiful secrets. In literature, he had become a monster. In reality, he was only a man who had loved life too much to accept leaving it.
And now the big question. Can you endure my French accent? Please tell me in the comments.